but so they'll say but s, and then they'll go baby, right? Or even if they sound out the entire word, they'll say baby, right? And you're like, wait a minute, you just sounded it all out, but then you said just, so they're kind of word colors. They're trying to use these things, but they're totally ineffective. Slow word perception that affects reading rate and fluency. So they'll try to either sound out every word, right? And it's very slow and laborious, right? And ineffective. Or they will recognize the words, but it takes them a long time to recognize those words. So it's much slower. So what dyslexia is not? It's not an oral language impairment, meaning these kids who have some language difficulties, right? And it's really just language based. They're not dyslexic, they struggle with language. A primary problem in attention or behavior. So I've seen kids in my career who are so severely ADHD that they cannot learn to read because they cannot pay attention to the words on the page long enough to read. And they have high IQs and all these things, but the attention is significant, or they have significant behavior issues. Maybe they're PTSD kids and they come into your classroom and you have to really manage those behaviors before they can learn, right? That's not a dyslexic problem. That is something else. So a primary problem in reading comprehension or written expression is not dyslexia. So when we're talking about reading comprehension, that's its whole own issue with reading, unless the comprehension is affected by a kid who has a type of dyslexia that causes reading to be laborious and slow. So they spend so much time interpreting these words or learning or trying to figure out what the word is that they lose their comprehension. Written expression. There are true written expression disabilities that have nothing to do with dyslexia. So, or low motivation to read. They really are not motivated, and when I talk about kindergarten and first and second graders, it's usually not a problem with motivation. It's a problem somewhere else, as far as, maybe at home they have issues at home, or it's attention, or it's, all kids really want to learn at that age. But at third grade, they may have become so burnt out, right? They no longer have that motivation because it was difficult and they just lose their motivation. Poor vision or hearing. Oftentimes we want to look at that vision and hearing to know if it's a problem with those two areas rather than just a true reading issue. Emotional or behavioral problems, like I said before, if you have a kid who has emotional problems and it's affecting their whole ability to learn, that's not dyslexia. Not saying they couldn't have both, but it's not, if it's the primary concern is their emotional or behavioral problems, it's generally not dyslexia. Limited intelligence. So, and I'll talk about that a little more because I think this is important to understand. And I've been reading a book by Ben Foss, and he's interesting because he is actually an adult who's dyslexic. And this is from his perspective. But, one of the things that he talks about is the difference in intelligence when we're talking about kids. So we used to look at that full scale IQ and say, well, if they weren't average intelligence, there's no way they have a specific learning disability in reading. And that's not necessarily true, because really what you look at is a pattern of strengths and weaknesses within a cognitive profile that may indicate that they have dyslexia, because they think differently oftentimes, or they have significant working memory problems. So there's a lot that we look at now as far as a cognitive profile that tells us a lot about a child and their dyslexia. Related to ethnic background or family income. One of the things that we know when we talk about reading disabilities or disabilities in general, we know that as we're testing kids, sometimes there are cultural factors that affect those tests, right? Or ESL kids, they used to test for, they used to give tests for reading, intelligence. And they would do it in English, even if you came from Germany or you came from any other country and you didn't even speak English. And they would assume that if you didn't know how to read those passages in English or comprehend those passages in English, that you were you weren't intelligent, right? So we know so much more about ethnic background and how that affects the testing. But family income, right? We all know that poverty is a risk factor for when we look at the reading scores or low scores in general in NWEA or any of these tests, right? Poverty is a factor. They're often not read to as much. They don't have the access, to reading materials as a lot of other parents. They often work longer hours, different jobs, so they don't have the time. So some of it's related. Some of this lack of reading abilities or reading vocabulary really comes from, some of those poverty issues. And also, when we look at specific learning disability as a category in IEP or in Article 7, one of the exclusionary factors is a lack of instruction, right, in reading or math. So a lack of instruction means that they didn't have the appropriate instruction to make that progress. So it's not the child's fault. It's a fact that they haven't had instruction. And some of that goes back to attendance problems. We're looking at, as we're trying to make these determinations now, we look at how much time they spend on e-learning, right? So is it a lack of instruction or limited educational opportunity? Or those kids we know who are transient, right? They've moved to 5 different schools. Right. So we have to look at all those things to determine whether this is truly a reading disability or if it's something else. So now we get into the different subtypes of dyslexia. Like I said, dyslexia is an umbrella term for meaning different things, right? Different types of dyslexia. And Sally Shayowitz, who we call the grandmother of dyslexia, she wrote one of the first books really on, an encompassing book on dyslexia. She would argue there are more categories, but I like to kind of stick to these 3 categories because I think they're the easiest to understand, and they easily describe all these areas. So phonological difficulties, so we call those dysphonetic dyslexics, right? They struggle with phonological awareness tasks and applying phonics. So these are the word guessers, the ineffective sound symbol understanding, right? So those are the ones that'll try to sound out a whole word ineffectively, and they will then put it together and say baby instead of baseball, right? So the dysphonetic kids are kind of easy to recognize, and we see those early, right? That K1 and 2 grades where we're really pushing those phonological skills. Surface dyslexics are different in the fact that they can't visualize words in a fashion where reading becomes automatic. So they're not fluent. They try to sound out words that you can't sound out, just like I was talking about the word no. Every time they come to the word no, no matter how many times you've told them the K is silent, they will sound it out and they will say no, right? They overuse then those phonics skills and those decoding skills because they got that. They understand that you're supposed to use those as far as reading, but then when it comes to really visualizing those words, they didn't get that piece. They don't see the letters. They don't see how those work. They don't recognize them every time they come to them. Like you'll even hear them sound out the word the 50 times. So deep dyslexics. Deep dyslexics are a mixture of everything difficult about reading. This is the rarest form of dyslexia. Most people either have a phonological or surface, with most kids falling within that dysphonetic range. Deep dyslexics are rare, but they don't have any keys to reading. They don't understand phonics. They don't recognize the words automatically, so they struggle with both things. So they're pretty easy to recognize because those are kind of your non-readers. Those are the kids that everybody's beating their head off the table trying to teach because they are not getting any of the skills. So let's talk a little bit more about phonological dyslexia. Like I said, it's the most common. It's 2/3 of children with a reading disorder. They're dysphonetic. They often have difficulty processing information through auditory channels. So that's that left hemisphere auditory verbal channel of learning. And you can almost always see the problem in working memory, because what happens is they may even get those individual sounds. T makes t, right? D makes da, right? They understand that. But when it comes to blending, putting the whole word together, they don't have enough spaces in that auditory working memory to hold it and then say the word. So they lack that ability. So poor decoding skills, right? Back to that word calling. Essential features of sound symbol associations have not been mastered. So when you go back to those beginning skills that they must start putting together, they're not mastering that. So K1 and 2, like I said, is really where we see these kids. over rely on their sight vocabulary. So they'll get all these sight words, right? If they recognize it and they can commit it to memory, they do pretty well, right? But they over rely on that. When they come to a word that they don't know, they don't have that key to figure it out. And they have extreme difficulty reading non-words. So if you give them those non-words, like I know letter cube naming is an intervention a lot of people use in those early years. And, you just kind of throw the letters out and, and whatever the letters come up, they got to sound it out, right? You start out with 3. They really, if it's not a word, if you don't roll a word, they're not going to be able to figure it out. And if it's not a word they recognize, they don't figure it out. Surface dyslexic, that goes down to 14% of reading disabilities. So they really have difficulty visualizing a word in a fashion. So early in my career, I didn't really understand dyslexia because, in my career, we only talked about specific learning disability and reading. Nobody wanted to talk about dyslexia, right? That was something we just didn't talk about. So I had this kid. He literally sounded out every word he came to. Never got it, never understood it, never knew any of the words. No matter how many times he saw the word the, he would sound it out, and then it didn't put it together. He literally was just sounding out individual letters and never making any sense. He couldn't read anything. And I was like, what is this, right? Because I didn't know. So they had him on a reading program called Fast Forward, and it was supposed to rewire his brain, is what they said. Fast Forward is a good intervention when you're talking about fluency. It is. But it's not going to teach him that skill that he needs as a surface dyslexic, right? So we spent a lot of time on an ineffective intervention. This is why when I talk about the different types of dyslexia, it's important to understand that, because that's what drives the intervention. It doesn't even matter what we call these types of dyslexia. As long as we understand where the deficit is, we can then prescribe something to help that child, right? So that's why that's why I really talk about these different types of dyslexia. It wouldn't even matter what they called them. I just want to know how best to help this child depending on what he's good at and what he's not. So you tend to break down every word, like I said, in that phonemic way. But reading never becomes fluid. It is never automatic. It is never fluid. And you will recognize these kids right away. And we see them mostly, like when I get a surface dyslexic, it's usually 3rd grade, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, right? Where we expect reading to become more automatic. It's not coming for them. Deep dyslexia, that's what I mean. You have a severe impairment in non-word reading. They don't understand it at all. These are the kids, too, that are really interesting and fascinating, right? They make those errors where the word would be gate, but they read it as fence, right? It's almost like, as we're reading and we're visualizing, they're kind of doing that, and they see gate, and they're like, oh, fence, right? Even though they may know, even if they knew the word was gate, they'll say fence. That's how they're visualizing it, and that's how they say it. It's a very interesting process. Visual errors: house is read as horse. Mountain is read as mountainous. Seems to be unable to use letter-sound relationships to decode words. They have difficulty reading function words as, the, so, infrequent words, non-words. It's really a lack of a key neurologically to open up reading. So, and like I said, intelligence does not predict dyslexia. It can occur in individuals with any level of intelligence, right? Whoopi Goldberg, Tom Cruise, Steven Spielberg, Alexander Graham Bell, musicians, politicians, Ben Floss, he is a famous author. He is an attorney. He's done all these things. And one of the things in his book that I thought was very interesting was, and it was a good reminder. He said this: even struggling readers need access to the material. Although we need to work on reading, of course, and helping them read, we also need to make sure that we're giving them access to these materials so they can learn. Audiobooks, hearing people read out loud, making sure that in the meantime, as these students are learning this process, that they're also gaining that knowledge. Because like I said, it's not about their intelligence. They can gain the knowledge. It's a neurobiological problem that they struggle with reading. So misconceptions. People with dyslexia cannot read. They have tons of interventions now available. It's just finding that right key to help them. They can learn to read. We just have to find the key that they need to be able to do that. Just because they have a high intellectual ability, they cannot have dyslexia. That's one of the things that people thought. The smarter they are, and that came to that when we looked at that cognitive ability and that full scale IQ. No, their IQ is too high. They can read. They just don't want to, right? So one of the things that we looked at in West Virginia that's different from here is we tested for gifted. And you'd have these kids, I mean, they weren't common, but you would have these twice exceptional kids where they were gifted and dyslexic, right? So they would be able to be in these gifted classes because they were gaining this knowledge and they needed access to that, but they also struggled with reading. So dyslexia is seeing things backwards. I talked about my inset. Dyslexia is a rare disorder. It is not a rare disorder. All right, one of the things Ben Floss said that I thought was really good was, you know, there's a book out there, it's called The Gift of Dyslexia, right? And he said this, dyslexia is not a gift. It's not a curse. It just is, right? It's just the way your brain functions. It has nothing to do with anything other than that. It just is. A lot of times, people used to think dyslexia cannot be diagnosed until at least 3rd grade. And that really goes back to that old kind of belief that dyslexia is about reversals, right? And so people would think, oh, okay, they say, you know, reversals are normal till 3rd grade. I got to wait till then. But see, it's about so much more. Although that can be a piece of it, it's about way more than just reversals. Children will outgrow dyslexia. People never outgrow dyslexia. They have interventions that help them grow as a person with dyslexia and learn to read as a person with dyslexia, but you don't outgrow it. Yeah, and like I said, people who reverse letters, young children, are, you know, they're not dyslexic. The type of instruction employed can cause dyslexia. So it used to go back, and since you guys are young teachers, you probably don't remember that, but you know, they went through different stages of teaching reading, and they still do. But you know, back when I was young, you know, most people were sight word readers because they kind of focused in on that, right? And we didn't really learn those phonics skills or the decoding skills, or you learned all decoding. Well, it didn't make us dyslexic. It made us, or dysphonetic dyslexics, it made it to where we just didn't learn the instruction piece of that. So it's not, instruction cannot cause dyslexia, right? Like I said, it's neurobiological. What we have learned about dyslexia from 1800 until now, we've been thinking about these reading problems for a long time, right? And we have learned so much more. And when you think about what we've learned in the past 20 years, even about the brain and how the brain works and how we read and how we can do scans and watch these scans as people read, it's fascinating. But what we know is dyslexia runs in families, right? Oftentimes on the social developmental history, when I'm looking at a child who may have dyslexia, it'll say learning disabilities in parents, right? They, you know, parents had special education services, or a sibling has special education services. We know that certain parts of the brain appear to be involved, and we can watch that on these brain scans. It's very interesting to see how differently the brain lights up when in a dyslexic child compared to a child who does not have dyslexia. Difficulties are apparent with word reading and spelling, right? You can see it across both of those areas. Confusions are noted with speech sounds, right? They hear things differently and they say things differently. Reversals of letter, right? It can be apparent or it cannot. It can be a symptom, it could not. Reading is slow and laborious, right? That child who takes a long time. Adults with dyslexia can have a slow reading rate and poor spelling. You know, it continues into adulthood, particularly if they haven't had appropriate interventions. And dyslexia does not affect all domains of functioning. You know, we see that pattern of strengths and weaknesses most of the time within these kids. Difficulties learning to read has a profound effect on self-esteem. Actually, they just had a kid recently in second grade in Texas who jumped out a second-story window because of the stress of round robin reading. He knew the kids were going to make fun of him and it was going to be very difficult for him to read. So he'd rather jump out a second-story window than read out loud in front of his peers. So we have to be really aware of those kids who are struggling and not put them in those positions. Problems in behavior and motivation decrease as reading skills improve. So when we think of lack of motivation or what looks like laziness in K1 and 2, it's really about a skill deficit that we need to address. They don't know how to say that, so they often quit. Effective factors must be considered in intervention planning, right? We want to look at these things that are having that are causing them to be depressed or anxious or, these things. We need to look at that as well as when we're looking at the reading, because it could be created because of the reading difficulties. So identifying signs of dyslexic at different grade levels. Like these are the things we're going to look at pre-K, right? Even recognizing and producing rhymes, right? Particularly a reduced interest in nursery rhymes because they don't understand the purpose of the nursery rhymes because they're not hearing the rhyming. Remembering route non-meaningful information such as names, phone numbers. So they struggle to remember everybody's name in their classroom, right? They'll call everybody boy or girl, right? They'll even struggle to remember your name. K through K1 and 2, right? This is where we're talking about particularly those dysphonetic kids. Segmenting words into individual sounds and blending sounds to form words, right? We see they're struggling with that already. Learning the relationships between sounds and letters. Confusing letters that sound similar, right? So they're D and T, B and P, F and V, right? They'll replace the V with an F sound or the F with a V sound, violin, or right? They're struggling with getting those sounds. Confusing letters that look similar, B, D, P, W and M, H and U, F, T. So like you'll see that when they're spelling in particular, as they're even writing these things, they're writing that wrong letter, right? They may have everything right, and then they'll replace the U with an H. Omitting grammatical endings in reading or writing, the S, the ED, the ING, right? So sometimes the word may be making, right? And they'll spell make and forget to put the ING. Learning basic sight vocabulary. And, those are the kids we're looking at. They're not really learning these sight words. Is this a kid that we're going to be seeing as somebody who's going to struggle with that surface dyslexia? Because they're sounding them all out, but they're not really getting those sight words. Remembering spelling words over time and applying spelling rules. So those are the kids that maybe on Wednesday they got 100 on their pre-test. By Friday, they got a 50%, right? Because, it looks like they know them, so they don't study anymore. And then they get to Friday and they no longer can do it because they don't apply those spelling rules. It was just a memorization of the night before. At 3 through 8, recognizing and spelling multisyllabic words. So they'll often leave out entire syllables as well as single sounds. Recognizing meaningful word parts, prefixes, roots, suffixes. They have no idea what you're talking about. Mixing up common sight words, where, there, what, then, right? So these common ones, they think they know them because they think, it looks same. They both have WH, right? Where and what. Where there and where have the same ending, and then they'll mix them up and they'll write, instead of writing where, they'll write there. Understanding and learning new information from text because of underlying word recognition difficulties. So, like I said, they don't automatically recognize those words. It takes them so long to read it, they lose meaning. But if you read it to them or they heard it, they understand everything about it. They struggle with taking notes, right? It's really difficult for them to copy from the board, from their papers, or to listen and write, because you'll look at their notes and it's nonsensical, right? Because they've mistyped the information, they've misspelled most words, right? So they struggle with taking notes. Learning across subject matter, right? So it's not just about reading. When you get into these 3rd through 8th grade, right, you're reading the material in science, you're reading the material in social studies, but it's taking them, once again, so long to read that they are losing meaning. So, it goes back to Ben Floss saying, we have to make sure they have access to audiobooks and things that will help them learn the subject matter while they're also learning to read. You can see it in spelling and their written composition. They don't have any fluency. They whenever you have time on task, particularly in reading and or writing and spelling, they often cannot do it because they don't, it takes them so long to do anything. In high school, college, and adults, I mean, these kids, word recognition, fluency, and rate affecting the ability to analyze texts. They need extended time to get things done. They don't take notes effectively, and learning a foreign language is nearly impossible with people who are dyslexic, right? Ben Foss talks about he tried, 2 or 3 different languages in high school, and he never could do it because honestly, he struggled with reading the English language, much less looking at the different sounds in different languages. So then he had to switch off what he didn't understand in English and try to pick it up in a different language. And they really are struggling with being able to do that. So dyslexia in the brain. Most of the specialized language processing system is found within that left cerebral hemisphere. So, and this is kind of the stuff that I geek out on, right? Because I'm always interested in this neuropsych stuff. But I think what you need to understand is reading is a very difficult process, and it's very different than anything else we do, right? Reading travels through our whole brain. And the one thing that's really important, particularly in that beginning reading, is what we call phonological loop, right? And it starts out with that working memory issue. So if they have a working memory issue, they can't hold it, they cannot go through that loop. Any break in that phonological loop is going to affect those beginning reading skills. When we don't get those beginning reading skills, it doesn't really go into the next part of that brain, right? Where we automatically recognize things. So that's what's happening within the brain. You don't need to know all this stuff. Just know that there's a phonological loop that reading must travel through initially for us to learn to read. And if there's a break there, it's going to be difficult. We know there's a genetic component. People are born with dyslexia. We've talked about that. Between 30 and 50% of children with a parent who has dyslexia will develop the disorder. So we're often looking at those genetics. Is there anybody in your family who's dyslexic, right? And you can often find those people. The developmental phases of reading, sight word reading is pre-alphabetic. You recognize words by environmental clues, right? Those of you guys are teachers. So with your own children, you're going around and you're saying, oh, there's McDonald's, there's a stop sign, there's this, right? We're talking about them so they can recognize those clues in their environment. Partial alphabetic readers make connections between some of the letters and sounds in written words. So they don't yet store these as sight words, right? Because they don't really have the sufficient letter detail, but they're just starting to learn that this letter makes this sound, and they're committing that full alphabetic. So those readers have complete connections between the letters and their sounds, right? They understand all this and they're gaining those. And they can start to pronounce unfamiliar, phonetically regular words, right? The CVC words are coming and everything's, falling into place for them. Consolidated alphabet, that's that knowledge of phonemes and graphemes relationships is fully developed. They have automaticity and they have a large sight word vocabulary, and they're starting to read fluently. And, this kind of goes through the phonological and phonemic awareness piece. And I want to make sure I have time to kind of go through some intervention pieces too at the end. So I'm going to kind of fly through this because I know that a lot of you guys who particularly, as new teachers, you guys have not been out of school too long. So you guys have a lot of the new research and reading. But that phonological awareness, that's just the ability to perceive and manipulate sounds. Impaired phonological awareness, though, is described as the key deficit, early marker, or predominant core cognitive correlate of dyslexia. So what that means is because 2/3 of people with dyslexia are dysphonetic, The impaired phonological awareness is our first key to that, right? If they're not getting that skill, we may be looking at somebody who may end up being a dysphonetic dyslexic person. And then phonemic awareness is the analysis of a phoneme, single speech sound. Phonological awareness contributes to accurate and acquisition of reading in 3 ways. Increases the understanding of the alphabetic principle, how spoken words are represented in print. Recognizes the ways that letters represent words, sounds, and words. Reinforcing knowledge of letter sound correspondence, determining a word when it is only partially sounded out, right? So as they're sounding it out, that's, if they don't know a word, they can sound it out. And that's why it's so important that we learn this. Symptoms of poor phonological awareness, articulation errors. We've been through this. So I'm not going to kind of go through it again, but, we know that there's difficulty in spelling and reading. Here's an important key. One of the subtests, particularly early on when we started looking at dyslexia and how to test for that, one of the most important tests that we give is rapid automatic naming. That is totally connected with reading accuracy, reading speed, and reading comprehension. And the reason why is because it tells us how quickly can they recognize symbols, right, and connect a word to it, because that's how we read. These letters are nothing but symbols on a page that represent a word, right? So when we're going through and it seems ridiculous, we're saying, okay, I want you to say these words: hat, tie, box, right? Just random stuff. How quickly can they do that? How much time? How many mistakes do they make when they're doing that? So in kindergarten and first grade, early naming speed deficits are a good predictor of students who are going to struggle with reading fluency later, right? Both naming speed and reading involve multiple perceptual, lexical, and motor processes. So we know that that's also, flowing through the brain in a similar way as reading would. The smooth integration of the contributions from visual, orthographical symbols to verbal, phonological labels and sounds, and attention, conscious effort. So how much attention can they pay to the symbols on a page? Orthographical awareness. So, that's the writing system of language that includes letters, words, numbers, punctuation mark, right? Those kids who just constantly